everyone. I'm Jane Lvovskiy, and I'm your partner for bookkeeping and controller services. And today with me, I have Irene Sinayskaya, who is a partner for employment law. And happy Wednesday. We're happy to continue our podcast. And today we're going to talk about having an employee versus independent contractor. So I was going to get started today and talk about some of the IRS guidelines. So there's kind of three criteria that we're going to look at. So one is the behavioral. Does the company have control or the right to control what the worker does, and how does the worker do the job? So basically, what kind of instructions are given, degree of instruction, evaluation systems, training. So for example, if you hire somebody who's a bookkeeping service versus a bookkeeper, does the client need to train somebody like me? Do they have to tell me what to do? So I qualify as an independent contractor because I don't need instructions. I typically would just go and perform on my own. Another criteria is the financial. So do I need to create a significant investment or some sort of unreimbursed expenses that I won't get, opportunity for profit or loss, or services available to the market and method of payment? So for example, how am I going to get paid for my services? Is it like a set price that the client is paying, or is it based on the work that I'm performing? Do I have opportunity to take other clients? If I do, then I qualify to be an independent contractor, right? I have opportunity to take other work. I have opportunity to explore other options. And lastly, type of relationship. Do I have any written contracts? Do I have benefits? Do I have permanency? Do I provide other like key activities to the business? So for example, most of my client work signs some sort of like agreement that I'm an independent contractor, right? And the way they pay is usually I would send an invoice. There's also no permanency. For example, if the client doesn't need services from me, they could stop anytime. If I'm no longer able to provide services, I could also give notice. And it's basically kind of a situation that I could leave pretty easily. So that would qualify to be like an independent contractor. For an employee, it would be a little bit different, and we'll talk more about that later. But if somebody is an employee, there's more kind of concrete hiring process and more concrete requirements, and basically the employees dictating when you do the work, how much you're going to get paid, and you're going to get training, you're going to get all the sort of like softwares. You're going to get the computer most likely. If it's just me, I use my own laptops, computer, and my own softwares, and most of the time I have to pay for it. And now I'm going to hand it over to Irene to talk about some of the legal aspect, and then we'll touch base on some of the other things. Irene, now I'll hand it.
Hi, everyone. So this week's topic is very important and something that both Jane and I discuss and review with clients almost daily. We've actually spoken even outside of this podcast in many times from both a accounting bookkeeping side as well as a legal side of whether the classification of a worker or somebody that's hired should be that of an employee or that of an independent contractor. And that's just something that we're very, very often asked by some of our clients that own companies. Sometimes, unfortunately, my firm already gets involved only when there's already a misclassification that already led to a certain investigation, an audit, or possibly even a lawsuit, at which point, of course, it becomes too late to really be able to fix anything outside of that investigation and outside of that audit. So it's vital in the beginning and at the time of hire to really understand the difference between an employment relationship and that of an independent contractor. And that can definitely affect the business directly, and that can affect the owner of the business directly as well. A lot of the times, any of these claims can carry some sort of personal liability with them as well. And so the owners are likewise responsible for any classification that they make. So it's important to establish the correct status and to always ensure that you have an agreement between the parties. I always recommend that an agreement be in writing between the parties that will spell out the status of this relationship. is the status that of an employment relationship, or is the status that of an independent contractor? And whether the relationship is one of employee and employer will depend on several factors. And Jane touched up on what those are, and I'll go into how the courts and how the Department of Labor really interpret what those categories that Jane discussed would look like. The overarching terms is that the courts will look at the supervision, the direction, and the level of control that you have over certain work that's provided and certain work that's done. But in order to determine if the relationship is that of an employer-employee, courts or the Department of Labor can look at any of the following. And this isn't an exhaustive list. There are certainly other factors that they can also look at, but these are what I found as the categories that are the most typically looked at by the courts. And that includes where and how services are provided, who provides the facilities, the equipment, the tools, the supplies for those services, whether there's any direct supervision of the employee, who sets the hours of work. Is it the individual who's been hired, or is it the employer? Whether the work requires exclusive services to be provided, or whether the individual is able to also work in other locations and provide these same services as well at the same time. Who sets the rate of pay, and who has the right to hire and fire. If it's one-sided, of course, that would be an employee-employer relationship. In an independent contractor relationship, the independent contractor is in business for themselves, and they offer services to the general public. So some signs of an independent contractor status can include, but of course it's not an exhaustive list, but what we've seen as the most typical that the courts or Department of Labor could look at is whether the independent contractor is an established business, whether they advertise outside and when they advertise on their own behalf, if they use any business cards or stationery, if they hand those out to other people as well, if they carry their own insurance. This is always a big one. Who has the insurance? Is it always the insurance always with the employer or the company for whom the services are being provided, or does the individual coming in have their own insurance? Do they keep their own place of business? Do they have, for example, their own hired employees as well? That of course will push the status and relationship likely towards an independent contractor. Whether they pay their own expenses. Of course, schedule is important. Control of really the schedule and the type of work is one of the most important factors that are looked at. And who controls or sets the pay rate, and whether they offer services to other businesses. In short, independent contractors are free from any supervision, direction, or control in performance of their duties. And that is essentially in full what the courts and Department of Labor, not being an exhaustive list, but what they'll look at really to determine this and to determine whether or not there was a possible violation in misclassification.
Okay, that makes total sense. So I think it's actually really important to make sure that you classify employee versus independent contractor correctly. So Irene, can you please discuss what is the risk of that misclassification?
So the risk is that there could potentially be a Department of Labor audit. There could be payroll practices violations stemming from any audit or any investigation. There could also be a lawsuit by a misclassified employee who was improperly classified as an independent contractor. And what happens is if it's found that there in fact was a violation, that could lead back to payroll practice violations. So if you're paying somebody as an independent contractor, that means that they're not being listed on your payroll. That means that there's no payroll tax being paid. A lot of the times the Department of Labor will go back with the payroll departments and the Department of Finance, and they'll go back and they'll assess a violation. They'll assess certain damages as well, in addition to what should have been paid. And then what we found very often is when these violations occur that are due to these investigations and these audits, that will then move forward and trigger a workers' compensation and disability audit as well. Because if the individual was not being paid as an employee, that means that they weren't being offered workers' compensation, no contribution for them was being made, no contribution for disability insurance. And so what happens is one misclassification can certainly expand outwards and cause other audits, investigations, and large penalties. And the issue, of course, is also that a few weeks ago, we had spoken about how the Department of Labor had hired new auditors, more than 100 new auditors. And of course, the risk is that they're in the wage and hour department, and wage and hour covers proper pay. It wasn't explicitly stated that they'll also be reviewing and auditing misclassification. But as we've seen in the past, it oftentimes does include that as well. Because again, if you are misclassifying, that means that the pay to them was incorrect as well. And so there's a huge risk, and that really ties in together with what we discussed, is that now is the time, in the event that there's a risk that someone is being misclassified, and you listen to some of these factors and you see that somebody really should be in a different category. And oftentimes that is an independent contractor who should really be listed as an employee. And if you hear that there is a level of control or supervision over that employee, if you hear that the way that the services are being provided, the way that you pay them really should be that of an employee status prior to any audit investigation, is really the time to start working on that, to try to fix that.
Right. And then, so do employees or independent contractors have to sign any documents?
So I did touch up on that as well a little bit beforehand. It's always my recommendation that there's a written document. We've in the past, when we've had quite a large audit with the Department of Labor, there were some individuals who absolutely should have been independent contractors just by the nature of what they did. And actually, they had outside billers, they had outside, not in office bookkeeping services as well, but they didn't have any agreements. And because they had so many other misclassified employees within the practice, so for example, they misclassified a front desk receptionist, and they had listed that as an independent contractor. And because that was already misclassified, the issue was that they were already the ones that had to defend themselves to prove that everybody else was properly classified. And that really made a big issue for all of the outside billing companies, the bookkeepers that did not have agreements with them. And that actually became a sticking point in that situation. So it's always important that it be established, especially in an independent contractor situation where you require the independent contractor to carry their own insurance. That term of insurance should always be stated and always be listed in the agreement, that they must carry their own insurance. Or if they're allowed to hire their own employees, if there are certain types of skill level that they have to have, that should also be in the agreement. So it's always recommended that, depending on the proper classification, you also have an agreement that goes together hand in hand with that.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Of course. I did actually have one question as well that we're oftentimes asked by our clients that I'd like to ask you. Jane, what type of documents would an employee need to provide to be set up on payroll? And what type of documents typically would a contractor need to provide?
Thanks. That's a good question. So when somebody hires an independent contractor, they should really collect a W-9 form, which is a request for tax ID number and certification. So basically, a person or a company needs to provide their EIN number or social security number with their address. And we find that by the time we need to file 1099s at the end of the year for independent contractors, a lot of times this information is missing for our clients. So we're trying to get it very last minute, and some people are just nowhere to be found. So it's really important to get that W-9 before you start paying people. So that would be the first for contractors. And then the employees, they have to give a W-4 which is the withholding certificate. Most likely, if they want to be paid by direct deposit, they have to get a voided check. They have to get all their personal information for other withholdings, their driver license, their date of birth. So there's a significantly more information that needs to be provided for the employee because, everything has to be entered through the payroll system. And, and also the hourly rate, or if it's a salary employee. So all of that has to be entered. So as you could see, employee has to give a lot more information than the contractor, but it's important to get those W-9 for contractors as well. I think this would be a good stopping point. I think we touched on so many things. And as you could see, it's really important to make sure that you classify employees and independent contractors and follow the guidelines. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you.